The heat radiating from the open oven door was stifling, clinging to my skin like a damp wool blanket. But it was nothing compared to the sudden, suffocating silence in the dining room. 15 people sat around Beatrice's heavy mahogany table. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and neighbors, all carving into the garlic and rosemary crusted lamb. I had spent the last 7 hours preparing. The gravy boat was still making its rounds when Beatrice, my mother-in-law, set her crystal wine glass down with a sharp, intentional clink. She waited for the dull roar of overlapping conversations to fade. When the room was adequately quiet, she dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, looked directly across the length of the table into my eyes, and offered a smile that did not reach her cold. A praising gaze. Clara. She projected, her voice carrying the practiced authority of a woman who had never been told to lower it. If you were to simply evaporate into thin air tomorrow, I truly do not believe this family would drop a single stitch. We run on our own steam. The laughter was instantaneous. It was not polite chuckling. It was a deep, guttural amusement that rippled through the room. Julien, my husband of 4 years, let out a weak, breathy snort into his water glass. His sister, Sienna, barked out a laugh so loud it startled the dog under the table. Even Uncle Arthur, who had just praised the tenderness of the lamb 3 minutes prior, guffawed loudly, shaking his head as if Beatrice had just delivered the punchline of the century. I looked down at my plate. I had not even served myself the lamb. I had a single piece of sourdough bread, a smear of butter, and a small portion of roasted carrots. My hands were shaking. Affine, barely perceptible tremor that I forced into stillness by gripping the edge of the heavy oak table. I picked up the bread. I took one slow, deliberate bite. The crust was dry in my mouth. I chewed, swallowed, and raised my eyes back to Beatrice, who was still wearing that triumphant, thin-lipped smile. "We will see," I said softly. Nobody heard me. The conversation had already pivoted, swept away by Uncle Arthur's booming voice complaining about property taxes. Nobody registered the shift in the air. Nobody noticed the exact moment a heart hardens into stone. 48 hours later, every single person sitting at that table would understand the full, devastating weight of my 3 words. My name is Clara. I am 31 years old. And for 4 excruciating years, I was the invisible mortar holding a crumbling family together while they ground me down into dust. To understand why I stayed, you have to understand the shape of the void I was trying to fill. I grew up in a town so small and forgettable, it felt like a ghost before it even died. My father passed away from a sudden, massive coronary when I was 20. My mother, entirely broken by the loss, faded away from a quiet, aggressive leukemia. Just 3 years later, at 23, I was entirely alone in the world I had no siblings, no extended family, just a rented apartment that echoed with the silence of people who were never coming back. I survived by teaching myself architectural rendering. I bought a secondhand computer, pirated some outdated software, and spent countless sleepless nights learning how to turn flat, lifeless blueprints into beautiful three-dimensional digital homes. I started by doing cheap renderings for local real estate agents, eventually scraping together enough money to live, but not enough to feel secure. Then I met Julian. He smelled like cedar shavings, diesel and rain. He ran a small, struggling landscaping company in the neighboring town of Pine Brook. He had calloused hands and a gentle, easygoing demeanor that felt like an anchor. And he brought me coffee when I was working late. He listened without interrupting, but more importantly, he offered me a doorway into something I craved with a desperate, pathetic hunger. A family. When we married, I packed up my tiny life and moved to Pine Brook. I thought I was gaining a mother, a sister, a network of people to call my own. I did not realize I was merely auditioning for the role of their permanent, unpaid servant. Beatrice ran the family with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of martyrdom. 20 years prior, her husband had fallen from a ladder, shattering his spine and permanently confining him to a wheelchair. Beatrice, an emergency room head nurse, had taken over completely. She worked triple shifts, managed the household, raised Julian and Sienna, and kept the family from total financial ruin. She deserved immense respect for her survival. The tragedy, however, was that Beatrice's identity became entirely consumed by her suffering. She was the martyr. She was the savior. She was the only capable woman in the world. And she viewed anyone else's competence not as an asset, but as a direct threat to her throne. When I arrived, young, quiet, and capable, Beatrice immediately designated me as the enemy. The Sunday family dinners were the battlefield every week. 20 people descended upon Beatrice's house. For the first few months, I brought side dishes. Then, Beatrice started complaining about her arthritis. Quietly, incrementally, the responsibilities shifted. Within a year, I was doing the grocery shopping. By year 2, I was prepping the meats, baking the breads, and setting the massive tables. By year 3, I was arriving at dawn to cook the entire meal, clean the kitchen, and serve the guests. While Beatrice sat at the head of the table, accepting compliments for the food I had bled over. "This lamb is extraordinary, Beatrice." A neighbor would say, "Thank you, dear." Beatrice would reply, not even glancing in my direction, "It is all about the marbling," and Julian did nothing. He would look down at his plate, chew his food, and pretend he was deaf. His silence extended far beyond the dining room. Julian's landscaping business, which he claimed was thriving, was actually a logistical nightmare. He was an excellent landscaper, but a catastrophic businessman. 6 months into our marriage, I took over his books. I built him a professional website. I generated digital renderings of his patio designs so he could close high-end clients. I managed his invoicing, chased down late payments, and filed his taxes. I worked 30 hours a week for his company on top of managing my own freelance clients, and I never saw a single dime for it. Julian's sister, Sienna, was 28, unemployed, and lived in Beatrice's guest house. She spent her days scrolling through social media, complaining about her lack of opportunities, and treating me with open, vitriolic disdain. She would intentionally spill coffee on the kitchen floor right after I mopped it. She referred to me as the help. When she thought I was out of earshot, I confronted Julian endlessly, late at night, in the privacy of our bedroom. I would beg him to draw a boundary. "She is your mother, Julian." I would whisper, tears of pure frustration burning my eyes. "But I am your wife. You have to say something. You have to tell them to stop." Julian would sigh, rubbing the back of his neck, his face contorted in an expression of mild inconvenience rather than genuine concern. "Clara, you know how she is. She sacrificed everything for us. She just needs to feel important. Just ignore Sienna. She is jealous. Do not make a big deal out of nothing. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is a choice." Every time Julian chose to keep the peace with his mother, he was choosing to sacrifice me. He was not a victim of Beatrice's dominance. He was comfortably hiding behind it. I was entirely broken down. My self-esteem was completely eroded. But beneath the profound depression, a quiet, methodical survival instinct began to wake up. For 2 years, I secretly siphoned a portion of my freelance income into a private encrypted bank account. $50 here, $100 there. I researched apartments in Charleston, South Carolina, a city 3 hours away, rich with architecture and far removed from Pine Brook. I knew the rental markets. I knew the demographics. I built my escape route in absolute silence. Then came the lamb roast, the laughter, the realization that I could disappear and they would only miss the services I provided, not the human being. The drive home from Beatrice's house that Sunday night was suffocatingly quiet. Julian turned on the radio, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel to a mindless country song, utterly oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting beneath our marriage. When we got home, he immediately stripped down to his boxers, collapsed onto the mattress, and was snoring heavily within 10 minutes. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching his chest rise and fall in the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. 4 years. 4 years of doing the heavy lifting. 4 years of being told I was invisible. I felt no rage in that moment. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I walked into the spare room. I pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the back of the closet. I moved with silent, practiced efficiency. I packed my laptop, my external hard drives containing all my work, my chargers, my passport, my birth certificate, and a week's worth of clothes. I took the small framed photograph of my parents from the nightstand. I walked into the kitchen. I slipped my wedding band off my finger. It felt foreign and heavy. I set it down gently on the granite countertop, right next to the coffee maker he would use the next morning. I did not write a note. Explanations are for people who are willing to listen. And Julian had been deaf to my pleading for years. At 2 a.m, I backed my old sedan out of the driveway, keeping the headlights off until I reached the end of the street. The drive to Charleston was a blur of dark pines and empty highway. As the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, casting brilliant streaks of violet and gold across the salt marshes, I pulled into a gas station. I took out my phone, blocked Julian's number. I blocked Beatrice. I blocked Sienna. I blocked Uncle Arthur. I systematically severed every digital tie to the town of Pine Brook. I sat in the driver's seat. The smell of salt water and diesel filtering through the cracked window. And I wept. I cried until my ribs ached and my throat was raw. I was not crying for the loss of my marriage. I was mourning the absolute foolishness of a girl who had tried to buy a family's love through servitude. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face, put the car in drive, and went to find my new life. My savings account held $18,000. It was enough to secure a tiny, sunlit studio apartment above a dusty used bookstore in the historic district of Charleston. The floor slanted, the pipes groaned, and the humidity curled the edges of the papers on my desk. But the space was entirely mine. I threw myself into my work with a manic, singular focus. I walked into every high-end architectural firm and interior design boutique in Charleston, armed with my tablet and a portfolio of my best renderings. I offered trial rates. I worked 16-hour days. The bookstore owner downstairs, a fiercely intelligent, silver-haired man named Elias, became my first true friend. He brewed strong black coffee and offered it to me every morning without asking intrusive questions. He saw a woman running for her life, and he offered a quiet, undemanding sanctuary. Through Elias, I landed a contract rendering a massive historical renovation project for a local boutique hotel. That contract led to another. Within 4 months, my client base had tripled. I was charging professional rates. I was eating well. I was sleeping through the night. The perpetual knot of anxiety in my stomach had finally unspooled, but the silence from Pine Brook was eventually broken. I had forgotten to block the librarian from Pine Brook. A sweet woman named Martha, who had never attended Beatrice's dinners. 6 months after I left, Martha sent me an email. Clara, I hope you are safe. I wanted to let you know what is happening here, just in case you need to prepare yourself. Julian looks terrible. He came into the library trying to use the computers to access his business website. It crashed 3 months ago, and he does not know the passwords. He has lost half his landscaping clients because he stopped sending invoices Beatrice tried to host the Sunday dinners, but she burned the food twice. And Sienna threw a screaming fit because Beatrice asked her to clean the kitchen. Nobody comes to the dinners anymore. Beatrice is telling the whole town you had a psychotic break and ran away to an institution. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. I felt a strange, hollow sensation, not joy, not vindication, just a profound, heavy sadness for a group of people so deeply committed to their own misery. I typed back a single sentence. Martha, please tell Beatrice I wish her the best of luck. A month later, I felt strong enough to retrieve the last pieces of my past. I hired a courier service in Pine Brook to go to the house and pick up a wooden trunk I had left in the attic. It contained the only things of value I had left behind. My mother's antique brass drafting compasses, a collection of her hand-drawn blueprints, and her silver locket. When the trunk arrived at my Charleston apartment, the shipping tape looked tampered with. I knelt on the slanted hardwood floor and threw open the lid. The trunk was empty. The drafting tools, the blueprints, the silver locket, all gone. Lying at the bottom of the dusty wooden floor of the trunk was a single sheet of heavy stationery. I recognized Beatrice's sharp, aggressive handwriting immediately. You abandoned your family. You deserve nothing from the past. Do not ever contact my son again. I sat on the floor for 2 hours, holding that piece of paper. The cruelty was so precise, so calculated to inflict maximum pain. She had stolen the last tangible pieces of my dead mother just to punish me for refusing to be her servant anymore. I walked over to my desk. I pinned Beatrice's letter to the corkboard above my monitor. I looked at it every single morning. It was not a source of pain anymore. It was high-octane fuel. By the end of my first year in Charleston, I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving. I signed a lease on a beautiful brick-walled studio space downtown. I hired an assistant. Myth firm, officially named Clara Stone Renderings, was becoming highly sought after in the coastal real estate market. Then came the invitation. The Charleston Historical Preservation Society, the most prestigious architectural board in the city, selected me to receive their annual Innovator Award for my digital reconstruction work on several downtown properties. The award ceremony was a formal gala held in the grand ballroom of a restored 19th century mansion. Hundreds of affluent professionals, politicians, and artists would be in attendance. I was asked to give a 10-minute acceptance speech. I spent weeks agonizing over that speech. I bought a stunning emerald green silk dress that made me look completely unfamiliar to the exhausted, flower-covered woman I had been a year ago. I did not invite anyone from Pine Brook, but small-town gossip is a virus, and it spreads through the digital world faster than fire. An architectural blog posted the announcement of my award on their public social media page. Martha, the librarian, liked it. Someone connected to Sienna saw it. The night of the gala was electric. The ballroom was bathed in the warm, golden light of massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters carried trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner. My architectural renderings were displayed on large, illuminated easels around the perimeter of the room. I was surrounded by colleagues who respected my mind, friends like Elias who valued my presence, and a community that saw me as a leader. Note à labore. When the society president called my name, the applause was thunderous. I walked up the velvet-lined stairs to the podium. I looked out over the sea of elegant faces. I adjusted the microphone. My hands were perfectly steady. When I arrived in Charleston a year ago, I began my voice ringing clear and strong through the massive speakers. I was entirely empty. I had been told in no uncertain terms that I was a completely forgettable human being, that if I disappeared, no one would notice. A quiet, sympathetic murmur rippled through the crowd, but architecture teaches us something vital. I continued, it teaches us that you cannot build a magnificent structure on a rotten foundation. Sometimes you have to tear the old house down to the studs. Sometimes you have to walk away from the ruins entirely and lay a new foundation in a place where the soil is actually willing to support your weight. I paused. Letting the words settle, I smiled. Thank you, Charleston, for being the firm ground I needed to build my life upon. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. I stepped back from the podium, my heart soaring. A brilliant, blinding feeling of absolute triumph washing over me. And then the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom violently swung open, standing in the entryway. Illuminated by the harsh hallway lighting was Beatrice. She was wearing her severe navy blue Sunday church dress, clutching her heavy leather purse like a weapon. Beside her stood Julian, looking completely terrified, wearing a wrinkled suit that hung loosely off his thinning frame. My stomach plummeted, a cold spike of adrenaline piercing my chest. Beatrice had forced her son to drive 3 hours into another state to a private gala she was not invited to, purely to destroy a moment that belonged to me. The applause slowly died down as people near the back turned to look at the intrusion. The string quartet faltered and stopped. Beatrice ignored the hundreds of staring eyes. She locked on to me, standing on the stage, and began marching down the center aisle. Julian trailed behind her, his eyes darting frantically around the room, suffocating under the weight of the collective gaze of Charleston's elite. You think you can just do this? Beatrice's voice cut through the massive, echoing room. She was not using a microphone, but her voice was a weapon she had honed for decades. You think you can abandon your husband, destroy his business, and parade around here like some kind of hero? The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the ice shifting in the cocktail glasses. 150 influential people stared in absolute, unadulterated shock at the woman in the navy dress screaming in the middle of a black tie event. I did not shrink. I did not cry. I stepped away from the podium, walked down the few stairs from the stage, and met her halfway down the center aisle. I stood tall in my emerald dress, looking down at the woman who had terrorized me for 4 years. Beatrice, I said, my voice eerily calm, projecting naturally in the silent cavern of the ballroom. This is a private event. You ruined my son, she shrieked, pointing a trembling, age-spotted finger at my face. Her face was flushed, dark red, a desperate, feral look in her eyes. You left him to drown. You stole money from him. And you ran away because you are a selfish, ungrateful little orphan who never understood the meaning of family. Gasps echoed through the room. Several men in the front row stood up, preparing to intervene. I held up my hand, stopping them. I wanted this. I needed this. I did not steal anything from Julian, I replied, my voice steady, loud enough for the entire room to hear. I took the money I earned from my own freelance work, the same work I did while managing his entire business for free. The same business that collapsed the moment I stopped running it for him. Julian flinched visibly. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of a single person in the room. Beatrice stepped closer, her chest heaving. We gave you a home. We treated you like blood. You owe us. I looked at her. I looked at the frantic, desperate rage of a matriarch who had finally realized she had no power outside the four walls of her own dining room. Here, in the real world, she was just an angry, bitter woman screaming at a stranger. Do you remember the lamb roast, Beatrice? I asked softly, stepping into her personal space. Do you remember sitting at the head of the table, drinking wine I poured for you, eating food I spent 7 hours cooking, and telling me that if I evaporated, nobody would notice? Beatrice opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes darted sideways, suddenly acutely aware of the hundreds of silent, judging faces pressing in on her from all sides. You told me I was invisible. I continued, my voice echoing like a judge reading a sentence. You told me I would not be missed. So I did exactly what you asked. I vanished. I gestured to the massive room, the beautiful renderings, the crowd of people, and yet, here you are. You drove 3 hours in the dark, barged into a room full of strangers, and made a total spectacle of yourself. Just to look at me. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that only she and Julian could hear. It seems you missed me after all, Beatrice, because without me, you have absolutely nobody left to abuse. Beatrice stared at me. For the first time in the 4 years I had known her, the iron mask cracked, her chin trembled. The terrible, suffocating realization washed over her. She had come here to humiliate me, to drag me back down into the mud. And instead, she had publicly broadcasted her own pathetic toxicity to a room full of people who saw her exactly for what she was. She looked back at Julian for support. Julian was already backing away toward the heavy oak doors. Mom, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. completely broken by the public humiliation. Let's go. Please, just stop. Beatrice looked around the room one last time. No one was smiling. No one was laughing. There was no Uncle Arthur to guffaw at her cruelty. There was only the cold, unyielding judgment of a world that refused to validate her martyrdom. She turned around. She walked back up the aisle, her footsteps heavy and slow, her posture suddenly looking frail and ancient. Julian followed her, pausing only once at the doors to look back at me. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, but I turned my back to him before he could speak a single word. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. The silence lingered for a few seconds. Then, Elias, standing near the back, began to clap, slow, rhythmic, and incredibly loud. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into applause again, louder than before. It was not polite clapping. It was a fierce, protective roar of validation. I took a deep breath, smoothing the silk of my dress, and walked back to my table. The ghost of Pinebrook had finally been exorcised. 9 months have passed since the gala. The updates from Martha the librarian have dwindled, mostly because there is nothing left to report. Julian officially filed for bankruptcy and closed the landscaping business. He works hourly at a commercial nursery now, living in the guest house on Beatrice's property. Sienna moved to Florida with a man she met online, completely severing contact with her mother. The grand Sunday dinners are dead. Beatrice lives alone in that massive, echoing house, sitting at the head of a mahogany table that no one ever visits, reigning over a kingdom of dust and silence. She still has my mother's drafting tools. I am sure she can keep them. They are just objects. I have the talent, the mind, and the future. It is a warm Saturday evening in Charleston. The air smells of jasmine and the distant ocean. I am hosting a dinner party on the rooftop terrace of my new condo. Elias is here, pouring wine. A few of my favorite clients are laughing near the railing. The table is covered in steamed crab, fresh corn, and crusty sourdough bread. I am not running around serving anyone. I am sitting in the middle of the table, leaning back in my chair, holding a glass of cold white wine. Someone asks me a question about a new architectural project. I answer them. They listen. They nod. They look me in the eye. I am not invisible. I never was. I was just standing in the wrong room, waiting for blind people to see me. If you are sitting at a table right now where your labor is expected, but your humanity is ignored, stop waiting for them to change. The hardest part is standing up. The rest is just walking out the door